Hello, I'm Jorge Getoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, President Trump's nomination of a new judge for the Supreme Court and its implication for the future of American justice. Our guest, attorney Joseph Malouf. Joseph Malouf, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Joseph, what President Trump is trying to accomplish nominating, and we're talking Brett Kavanaugh, that is 53 years of age, to the Supreme Court. What is the political strategy behind that?
First of all, he has to basically live up to his promise to the evangelical groups that supported him. That is to nominate a judge to the Supreme Court likely to overturn the case of Roe versus Wade, which is the landmark case in the United States that legalizes the right a woman has to have an abortion.
And
he wants to do it for a long time by naming somebody who's 53 years old, somebody who's conservative, somebody who is going to be in his decisions very much to the right. I think he's almost as far to the right as you can get, with the exception of Clarence Thomas. Kavanaugh would be, if confirmed, one of the most conservative judges that in all other decisions of immigration, crime, searches, anything, I think you will get a very conservative decision. And because he's 53 years of age, the president is trying to get someone, as he promised before, that could rule for decades in the court and change the course of our future.
Because in the United States, the nomination is for life.
Correct. Once somebody gets to the Supreme Court, most of the judges stay there for life, and they sometimes retire, sometimes they die working, like Justice Scalia. Judge Ginsburg, for example, she's beyond the age of retirement, but she's still there, and she's very
85.
active. Yeah, she's 85. She's very active.
And so, how political is the Supreme Court?
Well, the idea in a court system, and you see Mother Justice has her eyes covered, is because she's supposed to be fair. You're not supposed to be looking at people's race, gender, political affiliation, or anything like that when you render justice. Justice has to be based on the law and the facts, and not on who is asking for help. So Kavanaugh is someone who is very known to politics. He has worked for the Bush presidency. In fact, he was the attorney in Bush versus Gore. He's someone who's aware of the political process that sometimes the courts get involved in, because that case was decided by the Supreme Court against the Supreme Court of Florida to name George W. Bush as the president and not Al Gore. And that is something that I think Kavanaugh brings to President Trump. He brings a lot of political knowledge, which I think will make the court even more political than it already is.
For an audience that is not familiarized with the function of the justice in the U.S., we're talking about that the Supreme Court has 9 members. 5 of them could be, theoretically, has been, for example, conservatives, and
right.
4 of them we're talking about what they call liberals in the U.S. So let me write you what is popularly accepted who is who. We're talking that conservatives, you have John Roberts, who is 63, has been nominated by Bush Jr., W. Bush. Neil Gorsuch, 50, nominated by Trump. Samuel Alito, 68, nominated by, again, W. Bush. Clarence Thomas, 70, nominated by George Herbert Walker Bush, Herbert Walker Bush father. Liberals, Ruth Ginsburg, 85, nominated by Clinton, which is liberal according to the U.S. standards. Stephen Breyer, 78, nominated by Clinton. Sonia Sotomayor, 64, nominated by Obama. And Elena Kagan, 58, nominated by Obama also. So here the issue is, one of the judges, we're talking Anthony Kennedy, who is 80, is retiring.
Correct.
So nominating Brett Kavanaugh could eventually change the balance in the Supreme Court. And here is a big issue. That will be the confirmation that is going to turn to the right for decades?
Absolutely. The position of Justice Kennedy occupied in the court was what they call a swing vote. Sometimes he would vote with the liberals, and it would be 5-4. sometimes he would vote with the conservatives, also 5-4. So depending on what Justice Kennedy felt like, for example, the marriage between people of the same sex was legalized nationally by Justice Kennedy's vote. He's the one that provided that vote that broke the tie. If the decision is 4-4, then there is no majority and there's no precedent. So there is no effectiveness of the court unless there's a majority. So the president doesn't want to keep the court with only 8 people. He wants to fill it up right away, and he wants to replace Kennedy, who sometimes goes one way or the other, with someone who's always going to go to the right. And I think he's doing it with Kavanaugh. That will definitely maintain the court to the right. In all other cases, I think that John Roberts, in some cases, John Roberts, who's known to be conservative, but he also has voted with the liberals in the past, and he might become the next.
Like in Obamacare.
Yes.
And so how this is going to play, because analysts say that it has to have an impact in the midterm elections.
Well, it depends. If the president, he took a risk by naming Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh has had at least 9 years serving as a circuit court judge in the District of Columbia right here in Washington in very difficult, complicated, and controversial cases. So there are thousands of pages of decisions that he has made, and he has taken positions that may be subject to criticism in Congress. If they don't get him confirmed quickly, then the next election, which is in November, could become about who gets confirmed if the Senate changes from a majority Republican to a majority Democrat.
Because the ones who confirm the nomination is the Senate in the US.
Absolutely. The way a justice is replaced, first of all, they're named, like you said, for life. So they can retire at any time, but they could stay as long as they want to. They can never be fired. They don't have bosses. The president cannot fire them. Now, any official could be impeached if they commit a crime, but in general, we've never seen that in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court needs, in order to be named, you need to have the nomination process is started by the president. He picks the person. And then he goes to the Senate, where they provide advice to the president. Advice and consent, it's in the Constitution, means that only the Senate, a majority, and it used to be 60, is now 51%. Now that 51%.
There are 100 senators.
There are 100 senators, and 51 senators is 51%, which right now, based on the new rule passed by the Republicans, it's all they need to then confirm that judge. And once the Senate confirms the judge, no one can remove that judge.
And the Senate now is run by the majority of the Republicans.
Exactly. There are 2 or 3 Republicans that sometimes agree with the Democrats, especially on the issue of abortion. So if Kavanaugh, although I think Justice Kavanaugh will never say that he would overturn Roe versus Wade, because it's not appropriate to say that. The only way you can think about overturning Roe versus Wade is technically by having a case in front of you. And that obviously wouldn't happen during the interview process. So it could happen, depends on whether or not Kavanaugh gets confirmed, but there are a couple of senators that would not vote to confirm Kavanaugh if, in fact, he would somehow say that he would overturn Roe versus Wade.
And also how politics is being played regarding the justice or the nomination or the approval of the nominees. We have the case on the presidency of Barack Obama, the second term. March 2016, he finished his presidency on February 2017. So it's 10 months before the end of his term. There is a judge that suddenly dies, that is Antonin Scalia. So now he has to nominate a replacement. He nominated Judge Merrick Garland. The political games Republicans were playing, according to most of the analysts, is saying, given the fact that there's an election year, there is no sense that the current president decides who's going to be the judge, because in reality, it's going to have the impact in the following terms, and so on and so forth. So they not even accepted to hear in the Senate the nominee of President Obama. Right or wrong?
You're absolutely right, and it was a terrible decision. The Constitution does not provide for any exceptions to the rule that when there's a vacancy in the Supreme Court, the Constitution says the president will nominate the person and the Senate has to act on it. Now, this is at the highest level of government. There is nothing higher than the president and the Senate and the Supreme Court. And therefore, when the Senate refused to act and said, we're not going to nominate, you can nominate anybody you want, but we don't have time right now to put that person to vote because this is an election year, and they came up with those excuses. There's nothing in the Constitution that justifies that. The problem is, where do you go to complain? And there was no place to go, and that's why that happened. But unfortunately, the process has been politicized, and a lot of these members that the President Trump has nominated, this would be the second time nominating someone, come from a Federalist Society publication. These are individuals who are very conservative, and I think that while they're qualified to do it, that they're going to be political.
So what it ended up happening was that Merrick Garland was never been even heard in the Senate. The majority of the Republicans were pushing the nomination for Trump to be elected eventually, and he, meaning Trump, was the one who nominated and was approved Neil Gorsuch, that is a conservative. And therefore, President Trump is trying to make sure that the whole thing is turning to the right. But what is going on here? We're talking that Anthony Kennedy is 81 and is retiring, but as you mentioned, we're talking about Ruth Ginsburg that is 85, and she has been nominated by Clinton, perceived as a liberal, that eventually she could retire or she could have a health issue and she could not be able to continue. Means that given the fact that Trump is going to be here for at least 3 more years, the possibility that the Supreme Court turn to the right, even more to the right, increases?
Absolutely. And I really think that that is where the problem is. I think people have made a big deal about these last 2 nominations, and they really are not such a big deal. Both of these are replacing conservative judges, so they're not changing the ideology of the court. Still going to be 5-4, even with Anthony Kennedy, who sometimes voted one way or the other, you still had a mostly conservative court. Now, I think Ruth Ginsburg is a liberal, no doubt in my mind, probably the most liberal justice in the court at this time. I also think that she's very frail. She's, fragile. I think she could, have an injury very easily. You can see that she's not in the best of health, and it could happen that she retire sooner rather than later, and then Trump would get to fill yet another vacancy. If the president does get to do that, and he picks a 3rd justice from the Federalist Society list of 25, then I think that cases like the abortion case and things of that nature, affirmative action, rights like that are going to be profoundly affected.
Death penalty.
Death penalty. All of that would be profoundly affected if that happens.
In the case of ideology, so if we have that scenario in front of us, where the country is going in terms of ideology with a Supreme Court that is aiming on that direction to the right?
I think you're going to see more immigration problems. You're going to see more travel bans. You're going to see more protective cases for not the people, but for the government. I also think you're going to see more restrictions on abortion. I don't think the court is going to outright say Roe versus Wade, it was a bad decision. I think they're going to allow states to create restrictions on abortion. For example, in Texas, there was a law that required anyone to travel several miles to a facility that had, like a hospital, crash carts, and they had big responsive units. So they made it so that the places that could give an abortion wouldn't be able to afford to do that anymore because there were so many requirements they had to meet, therefore reducing the number of abortions. I think that's what we're going to be seeing more with a conservative court that changes the ideology of what the current court is.
And the issues that has been more controversial so far in terms of the court. You were mentioning, for example, abortion, a key issue. and the case of Roe versus Wade. Explain, please, to an audience that has no idea what is Roe versus Wade, what it was about.
Roe versus Wade was a case from 1973 that addressed the issue of whether or not a state has the right to deny a woman the right to have an abortion. And the federal law doesn't address this issue. The Constitution doesn't really say anything about abortion, but yet the Supreme Court, in a decision of 5-4, including the vote of a conservative judge named by President Reagan, which was Sandra Day O'Connor, a woman, voted in favor of a case named Roe. That's a common, not really a real name. Roe just represents any woman who would be pregnant and wants to terminate her pregnancy. Wade is Department of Health. And the right that was decided in that case, the court said, came from the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the amendments, the First Amendment, the Ninth Amendment. They said that it is implicit in those rights, the right to have an abortion, but only during the first trimester. During the second trimester, they said there could be some regulation. Some people may or may not. However, during the third trimester, they said no abortion at all. No one can have an abortion during that time, because it became a debate between being pregnant and just having a change in your body versus the protection of a child.
Of a life.
Of a life. And the Constitution, under the 14th Amendment, provides that you cannot take the life of anyone in this country without a process called due process. So if you're doing an abortion on a life, then that's denying that life of the right to be sentenced by a jury and to go to court and to have a process before being executed, if you will. So it's controversial because the Constitution doesn't mention abortion, it doesn't mention any of this. And the court just interpreted that based on the rights to vote and the right to First Amendment and the right to bear arms, all these rights that you get. The court said, well, if you're going to give somebody the right to free speech and the right to have arms and the right to have this and the right to have a lawyer, then at least you got to have the right to do with your body what you please. But again, once there is another life, and later on, United versus Webster, in that case, another case that came after Roe versus Wade, the decision was modified to say that if the fetus can live outside of the womb, it's called viability. If you can live outside of the womb, then there's no way you can have an abortion. Instead of having a strict calendar, it is depending on where this baby is. Is it a fetus that doesn't have protection, or is it a fetus that now has protection? It all depends on viability. Can that technically, not that the child has to, obviously, but if it is mature enough and developed enough that it could live outside of the womb, then that fetus has protection under the Constitution.
And if Kavanaugh is not only nominated because he has been, but is being approved by the Senate, how the issue of abortion could turn? Why the fears of the liberals?
The fears are that there will be more and more restrictions, making it very difficult for some women to go have an abortion. And in the past, before 1973, what was going on in the country was a serious crisis. There were women going into dark alleys and basements to have illegal abortions with coat hangers. They were pulling their fetuses. And there were many dying of, infections, hemorrhaging. And so it became a very dangerous world for a lot of women, and a lot of people cannot afford to travel. So the president said, if we eliminate Roe versus Wade, we're just going to give it back to the states and let the states decide whether abortion is legal. So there might be a state that's more liberal, that, let's say Massachusetts, more progressive, more liberal, compared to Alabama, that is more conservative. So you would have some states just simply deny the right to an abortion, and other states say you can have an abortion to try to limit the number of people who have abortions. I think abortions are terrible. It's certainly a horrible thing to have. However, the consequences are that a lot of other young girls are going to die. Some of them are going to commit suicide because they won't know what to do under the circumstances. So those are the negative parts of abortion that in the past used to occur. I think people don't know that anymore. I think because it's been legal for so long, they forgot how bad it was.
And Kavanaugh could play a role here.
I think so. I think Kavanaugh would, in fact, overturn Roe versus Wade. And again, it won't be a big announcement, we're overturning it. I think it's going to be gradual. every state that wants to restrict abortion will begin to pass laws that are restrictive. And then they get to the Supreme Court, and the decision is this restriction okay or not? And you'll see the restrictions grow until basically any state could deny a woman the right to choose.
Elections, presidential elections in the US, George W. Bush against Al Gore. And there is this big issue. There are discussions about the results in Florida. We're talking about 530 votes was the ones who decide the presidency of the US. And the whole thing reached the Supreme Court.
Correct.
Kavanaugh was, you were mentioning,
Yes.
the lawyer of George W. Bush.
Correct.
And at that point, the people who live in this country say, how is going to react the Supreme Court, given the fact that there are 5 conservatives, meaning of the right, and 4 meaning to the center left, let's say. And Al Gore represented the center left.
Correct.
People were betting that given the fact there was a majority of conservatives, meaning rightists, was going to be the decision of saying that George W. Bush was the new president. Means that also ideology was playing a role in that decision?
I think so, and the reason is because if you recall in that case, the Supreme Court of Florida took that case right away and decided based on Florida law that the election belonged to Al Gore. Then President Bush, with Kavanaugh, Brett Kavanaugh, went to the Supreme Court and said, the Supreme Court of Florida is wrong. They don't know about Florida law. You know more about Florida law than the Florida Supreme Court. And the court overturned the decision and said, you know what, you're right. And President Bush is the winner. So that's an example. I think the problem, the root of the problem, is that our method for electing a judge is a political method. It is elected by nominating, the president nominating someone, so that's a political position the president has. And then the president wants to look good with his constituents. So you see the political nature of nominating someone that the constituency likes. Kavanaugh is liked by Trump's base because he's very conservative. So you see, from the very beginning, it's all political. It's from the nomination process. And now you're going to see the country get hit with advertisements supporting Kavanaugh, and advertisements criticizing Kavanaugh. And now you're going to see lawyers like myself and others commenting about certain decisions that Kavanaugh took. You know, Kavanaugh didn't make the decision for the woman who had an abortion who was undocumented and detained by the president and his administration. They didn't want to get her to the abortion clinic. She filed a lawsuit, came to Washington, D.C. She won, and then that decision was appealed. And the Court of Appeals, where Kavanaugh was one of 3 judges, 2 of the judges agreed, and she had the abortion. She had been raped. It was a rape abortion. Yet, Kavanaugh wrote a dissenting opinion, which means he just wrote an opinion criticizing the other 2, even though he lost. And he said, now what? We're going to give illegals abortions on demand? What is next? It shows you Kavanaugh is unlikely to support abortion or immigrants.
Is he going to be approved by the Senate before the midterm elections?
I believe so. I think that Mitch McConnell knows the importance of not going to the midterm elections with a vacancy in the Supreme Court, because it could wake up the Democratic Party and go vote, just because they know that if the majority in the Senate becomes Democrat, that the president is going to have to nominate someone a lot more to the center, because he will need the Democrats in order to get that confirmation.
Is it really 3 powers, independent powers in the U.S.? We're talking executive, we're talking the Congress, and we're talking the judiciary, or the judiciary is a political branch of other one?
I think they're all political. However, the power is divided between the 3. However, this president doesn't seem to think like that. The executive branch, which is independent, gets checked by the Supreme Court, which is the judiciary, and then the Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives, they also get checked by the Supreme Court. So one checks the other. It's called checks and balances. The problem is that this president doesn't believe in it, so he likes to act independently.
Joseph Malouf, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
In South America and the Caribbean, we face